From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, all you book festival folks. I'm Tom Sherwood from NBC4 here in Washington and the public radio WAMU Kojo Nnamdi show on Fridays. Thank you for being here. You're welcome, your cell phones are not. But I always say don't turn it off. If it rings, we just want you to put it on speakerphone so we'll know who's calling you. And by the way, this is your legal warning. Your presence here is your permission to be videotaped and quoted and misrepresented on social media. Now, finding your way around this huge convention center that opened in 2003 can be daunting, going up and down floors, in one room and then another, finding food, finding the bathrooms, lining up for autographs. You might say being here today is, quote, enjoyably exhaustive. Enjoyably exhaustive. Well, that's the high praise the New York Times review gave to Douglas Brinkley's latest book on American politics and culture, Rightful Heritage, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Land of America. I, incidentally, will not be exhaustive. In his nearly 24 books over 25 years, historian Brinkley, no related to that other guy, has rewalked and retraced so many elements of America: our wars, our politics, our industry, our natural disaster called Katrina. The Rice professor especially has been honored for his attention to Franklin D. Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt. So it's fitting in this year, the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, and not far from the FDR Memorial and the Potomac River Island named in Teddy Roosevelt's honor, Douglas Brinkley can help us understand America. And here in the nation's capital today, as we celebrate this book festival, as we open the new African American Museum on the National Mall, and yes, as we steel ourselves for Monday night's, not football, but presidential debate in this difficult campaign year, in these next few minutes, maybe Douglas Brinkley can offer insight and hope in this still forming sweet land of liberty. Please, everyone, welcome Douglas Brinkley.
It is wonderful to be introduced by Tom, who has an extraordinary voice. And I try to modulate mine. I'm used to talking loud because I'm a Rice University professor, and you have to project without microphones. But I'm here to talk about Franklin D. Roosevelt and the national parks. FDR, we all know, was called the Squire of Hyde Park. He was born in 1882 in the Hudson River Valley. And his whole life, the Hudson became his sanctified landscape. It's the place that he most loved. He was born on Hyde Park on the Hudson. He lived in the same home where he was born all of his life. And he's buried at Hyde Park. It's our nation's first presidential library. And he would always find strength from that river, 315 miles going from the high Adirondack Mountains coming into New York City. It is a spectacular river. And when he was born in 1882, his family was part of keeping the Hudson beautiful movement. Today we call it the Scenic Hudson movement. But everybody was starting to look at resources being destroyed in the East Coast. This is when he's born, the idea of the Weeks Act, where you save national forest in the East, and everybody was clear cutting, and the river was getting polluted, and fish stocks were dying. And so Franklin Roosevelt's father became very popular in local conservation on the Hudson. And they're also the #1 book writer. I'm at a book festival. If you were alive in 1880s, 1890s, 1900, the big writer was John Burroughs, the great naturalist who sanctified the Catskills. And so FDR grew up. Conservation, as we call it today, was part of his life script, most famously because Theodore Roosevelt, his fifth cousin, who he nevertheless called Uncle Teddy or Uncle Theodore, he, as you know, is synonymous with the conservation movement, Theodore Roosevelt. And TR always enjoyed looking at from New York City, but looking west. FDR was more about the oceans and the rivers. But by the time Franklin Roosevelt goes to college, to Harvard, and you need to know, if you want to understand anything at all about Franklin Roosevelt, you have to study Theodore Roosevelt. He took as a model, Uncle Theodore's life as sort of a script. So Theodore Roosevelt had been the head of the Forest Fish and Game Commission in New York State. FDR becomes the head of it. Theodore Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. FDR, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt was Governor of New York. FDR was the Governor of New York. Theodore Roosevelt loved Big Navy. FDR loved Big Navy. Theodore Roosevelt loved conservation and the natural resources and heirlooms of America. FDR loved all of those. Theodore Roosevelt had a niece named Eleanor Roosevelt, and FDR married her. You cannot deal with all the revolution of the New Deal years in conservation and the Civilian Conservation Corps and the like, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, without thinking about TR. But Theodore Roosevelt created two mechanisms as president, guys, that, all national parks, we're here celebrating the system was born under the Organic Act in 1916 by Woodrow Wilson. But that Organic Act, for a national park, it has to go through Congress. So Theodore Roosevelt, as president, would do that. From 1901 to 1909, he pushed through Crater Lake in Oregon, Mesa Verde in Colorado, Wind Cave in South Dakota, and others. But Theodore Roosevelt, as president, created two mechanisms which all presidents followed have used, and one is called national monuments. And the idea is built on the Antiquities Act of 1906. The Antiquities Act was an elastic piece of legislation which said for scientific reasons, mainly meant for archaeological digs of prehistoric dinosaur bones, and for Native American relics, that a president could declare, ward off an area. Think about it like a murder site with the yellow piece of plastic, going around. A hunk of land that could be, by executive order, saved. And the reason this Antiquities Act of 1906 went into play is the Europeans were robbing our Western sites. They recognized the importance of the Navajo and the Apache and the Plain Indians, and they were stealing things. And they were stealing our dinosaur bones. So this gets passed on Congress. Well, Theodore Roosevelt ends up going to Yellowstone with John Burroughs, the great naturalist. Then he goes to the Grand Canyon, and TR stands at that canyon, looks out over the divine abyss, and says, "Do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone." And Congress and Senate starts moving to perhaps mine it for zinc, asbestos, and copper. And Theodore Roosevelt then uses the executive order meant for smaller parcels for over 600,000 acres. And now it's over a million acres today, or else the Grand Canyon would have been lost. And TR would do that to save the redwoods at Muir Woods. He would do that, to save Devil's Tower, Wyoming. So that lives on due to Theodore Roosevelt. Barack Obama is now the president that has signed more national monuments than any other. I just wrote a piece about a week ago in the New York Times about it. Secondly, 100 years ago, women here would have worn a bonnet with ornamental feathers to hear me speak. You may not think you would have, but you would have. And these would have been feathers of an egret or a heron. Nothing calls for federal action more than bird protection. You cannot have a liberal Connecticut Audubon Society that's protecting the birds to have them fly to Florida and be slaughtered willy-nilly. Birds know no boundaries. So it demanded federal attention if we were going to save species for extinction. And Theodore Roosevelt goes to Pelican Island, Florida, a bird rookery where these guys were coming with guns and gunning all the birds and plucking the feathers and then stealing the eggs. And he says, I so declare it a federal bird reservation. And he does that 51 times, saving the albatross of Hawaii, saving parts of Alaska the size of West Virginia, and giving these areas to wildlife. Those 51 are later expanded by dozens to over 100 to 200 by FDR. And it's Franklin Roosevelt building on TR's bird reservations that creates in 1940 today's U.S. Fish and Wildlife. You all here in the audience own over 550 national wildlife refuges because of TR starting it and FDR moving on it. And for those national monuments I just mentioned, when you can't get a piece of land saved through Congress, you do the executive order. So many places that we all celebrate in this country. Capitol Reef in Utah, a great national park. FDR creates it as a monument. Today it's a park. Channel Islands off of Santa Barbara area in Ventura, California, gorgeous islands, the Galapagos of America. FDR saves it as a national monument. Today it's a park. The Olympics, national forest up there, beautiful rainforest in Washington State. FDR went there and saw how people were recklessly clear-cutting the land. And Franklin Roosevelt said, whoever did that, I hope they're roasting in hell. And he pushes through the creation of our Olympic National Park. So keep in mind the monuments and wildlife refuges are both Roosevelt's, but FDR takes it to a new level. Now, the turning point for Franklin Roosevelt, I think, as a true conservationist to match and perhaps supersede Theodore, occurs in 1921. FDR goes and he loses. We're dealing in an election right now. In 1920, it was Warren Harding beat Cox and Roosevelt. FDR was the VP in 1920. The Democrats lose. FDR had no job. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was just now the losing VP candidate. And he asked himself, what would Theodore Roosevelt have done? And the answer was he worked for the Boy Scouts of Greater New York. TR was the great pusher of the Boy Scouts, the godfather of it. And now Franklin Roosevelt organizes the Boy Scouts of Greater New York to go to Bear Mountain State Park on the Hudson River in his backyard up there and bring all these inner city kids to do horseshoes and archery and fishing and enjoy the bounties of nature in the Hudson. And unfortunately, he went swimming with these Boy Scouts, and we think there contracted the polio virus. And he didn't manifest itself till he got to Campobello, New Brunswick. And while he was there, he went to bed. He had sweats. He didn't feel well. And he woke up with no feeling in the lower half of his body. The man you all know for saying, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, was in utter fear and panic and terror. Eleanor Roosevelt became his Florence Nightingale. It was very generous of her because she had found love letters from Lucy Mercer that FDR was having an affair. She put all that aside, and he goes back to Hyde Park on the Hudson to heal, and nobody wants to see him because to hug somebody with polio would have been a fear of you would have contracted it. So all these friends, Mr. Good-Looking, Mr. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Mr. I was just the VP nominee, is now a pariah. And he found solace on the Hudson among the squirrels and the birds. FDR was a lifelong ornithologist. And then he says, what did Theodore Roosevelt do in his crisis? Theodore Roosevelt's big crisis, guys, was not when he was the Rough Rider in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. Theodore Roosevelt's big crisis wasn't when he got shot in 1912 in Milwaukee when he was delivering a speech for the Bull Moose Party. Theodore Roosevelt's huge crisis came when he was a young man On the same day, Valentine's Day, TR lost his mother in the same house, his mother with Bright disease, collapsed kidneys, and his wife died giving childbirth. He lost his mom and his wife on the same day, Theodore Roosevelt. We, as scholars, read people's mail for a living, and there's nothing more moving than seeing the giant X that TR puts in his diary and says, "The light's gone out of my life forever." What does he do when he's depressed, losing a mother and wife? He got lost in the wild. He went to North Dakota, the Dakota Territory, Medora, the Badlands, went looking for grizzly and buffalo. In fact, he starts the modern endangered species movement of protection of North American animal life when he kills a buffalo, Theodore Roosevelt, up there, and then realizes they're all disappearing, and he creates a Boone and Crockett Club to save them. So FDR gets lost in the wilderness, but he goes to the Everglades. And Everglades is a national park that Franklin Roosevelt creates, but he goes in the Everglades and the whole Florida Keys and goes boating, and he thinks that water will help him with the polio, and he's down there with an ornithologist friend in the 1920s, writing down all of the different species he sees. He's bird watching and trying to heal in nature, the way TR had done in the Badlands. He comes back from these Florida trips and buys Warm Springs, Georgia, a resort of natural thermal pools in Georgia, Meriwether County. You can go there now. And he creates a resort for people with polio, living in nature among the trees and the rest. And that's his business, FDR. And he becomes the leader of the state park movement. Do you guys realize that FDR in the 20s is pushing state parks? But by the time he's president, the New Deal will create over 800 state parks in the United States. States didn't even have state parks until FDR's New Deal workforces came and built them, including Texas, where I live in Austin, and I teach at Rice in Houston right now. And he then decides, well, I'll try to get back into politics, FDR. And he trains to give a speech at Madison Square Gardens for Al Smith, the big shot in New York. And his training isn't practicing his verbiage. It's learning how to lean on one son and move his hips in a very painful motion to get to the podium. And everybody at Madison Square Gardens, when FDR came out, held their breath. First off, everybody thought he was done with politics. He was too sick. Here you're just praying he doesn't fall. Then he got to the podium and gave an amazing speech and got a thunderous standing ovation. Off the charts. Went on almost an hour. Next day's New York Times says, "Move over, Al Smith. FDR's the man, and he's the hot guy in politics now." And from that resurrection, FDR runs for governor in 1928 of New York, and then governor in 1930, and he wins both. And his big program is planting trees, soil conservation, reforestation, because he was a rural, upstate New York politician, FDR, not a New York City guy. I've read letters Franklin Roosevelt would write, "Please do not say I'm from New York City." His constituents were apple growers and people growing orchids and lumberers in the Catskills and fishermen. And he was a rural politician, and he worked as governor to pay men with no jobs, unemployed, homeless, essentially $1 a day to start tree planting and building state parks and restocking lakes and ponds. Franklin Roosevelt's whole calling card was conservation as governor. So when you cut to 1932, when he gives the New Deal speech, and you cut to Franklin Roosevelt saying we're going to put people to work, he, in his own mind, creates the Civilian Conservation Corps. And not only does he beat Herbert Hoover, but at his famous inaugural, weeks later, he announces his pet New Deal program, the CCC. The CCC, from 1933 to 1942, plants around 3 billion trees across the United States. because these are done by unemployed men. Somebody from Newark, New Jersey suddenly finds himself in Zion National Park in Utah, or somebody, from a poor neighborhood of Philadelphia suddenly on the New Mexico-Arizona border. It was remarkable, and it worked. And because the big mistake we make is thinking about the Great Depression being Wall Street collapse and the financial markets and bank foreclosures, we had destroyed the land of America. We had done the great plow up in the Midwest and chopped all the trees. We had soil erosion, man-made problems, environmental disaster of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. We had drained wetlands. We had drained swamps. And so it became a absolute a landscape of America that was dying. And he takes it over, and he is able to, as president, take TR conservation to a new level. Do you want to know how committed Franklin Roosevelt is to our parks in the love of America? Franklin Roosevelt, at the time of Pearl Harbor, this is the big moment at Pearl Harbor, he gets a letter from Rosalie Edge with his great Harold Ickes, the best Interior Secretary in American history. And Edge is a conservation environmental activist from New York, and she says, "Dear Mr. President, the trumpeter swan is going to go extinct because you have built the 10th Mountain Division, a training facility for ski troopers at Henry's Lake, Idaho. And it happens to be that area, the water doesn't freeze over, so the trumpeters spend their winters there instead of migrating. And if you don't do something, trumpeters can go extinct." Well, the 10th Mountain Division facility cost like $24 million. It was training our soldiers to go fight in Italy and Germany and in Europe. And FDR writes a moving letter to his Secretary of Defense, Henry K. Stimson. "Dear Henry, I've now found out about the flap between the U.S. Army and the trumpeters. I've looked into it, and the verdict is in. I side with the trumpeters. The 10th Mountain Division must re-nest. Sincerely, Franklin D. Roosevelt." Why at the time of Pearl Harbor would he do that? Well, who here doesn't want to save trumpeter swans, the species? Okay, but this is the big crucible, because he is telling the War Department, and he'd write letters like that to Agriculture Department and to every division in government, our public lands are an inheritance. We are not going to destroy our national forest and parks and monuments and state parks by going in for win the war. These are what we're fighting for. Our public land system is what America's about. It's our heritage. Hence why I call my book Rightful Heritage. That's what he would call all of these recreation places and special places we have. He did something similar to save the whooping crane from extinction by signing an executive order creating Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas. On national parks, guys, June 6, 1944, D-Day. Do you realize on D-Day here in Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, when all the news was coming, wouldn't cancel a meeting about Big Bend National Park, and he takes the land deed for it on D-Day with Amon Carter and people from Fort Worth, pictures on D-Day with maps that he's picking out where the roads and how one could bring visitors to Big Bend. He goes to Glacier National Park and makes them set up radio shop there so he could stand with the CCC and say there is nothing more American than our national parks. In 1937, he traveled and created Cape Hatteras, our nation's first national seashore, creating a whole new designation. John F. Kennedy was very keen on that, and that's why Kennedy saved Cape Cod National Seashore, South Padre Island in Texas, Point Reyes in California. But little known is Roosevelt would go all over on his yachts and on Navy ships, and he disappeared on the eve, really, of World War II in the late 1930s to go disappear into the Galapagos Islands. FDR went for weeks doing floral and fauna collections for the Smithsonian Institute, looking for new species of burrowing shrimp and fish, because this love of biology and conservation is in the Roosevelt's bloodstream. I will end by telling you two quick things. Whenever Franklin Roosevelt put on a form occupation, he would write tree farmer. He ran tree plantations at Warm Springs, Georgia, and on the Hudson. If you go to his home, you will see the forest he planted. All that was when he would bring Churchill to Hyde Park. He was showing off the forests that he planted and how he was a scientific forester. It meant everything to him. He had learned inside out about soil conservation. FDR thought that deforestation, the killing of trees, meant utter poverty. So much so that at the time of Tehran conference, he went over and, of course, was in the Middle East, and he comes home and writes a personal letter to the Shah of Iran and to the King of Saudi Arabia saying, well, I've been to your part of the world now, and I've got to tell you, you've got a forestry problem. And I'm personally willing to loan my time pro bono to help you fix it. Do not feel bad. We had this problem out of, the Dust Bowl, and where we know some of it, but I've figured out ways to help. Do you realize that in 1945, right before his death, April 12, 45, Franklin D. Roosevelt was working with Gifford Pinchot, the chief forester for Theodore Roosevelt, who's now in his 80s, had a couple of heart attacks, was going to be dead soon, and they conspire together to make the founding of the United Nations. A key principle was going to be conservation as a basis of permanent peace. And FDR was moving to have sharing of natural resources, to have global pollution laws, to have ways that we had international forestry and wildlife protection laws. Everybody at War and State Department was running. They would ignore him. And one of the few times I ever saw FDR was angry when he wrote a letter and was telling his State Department, I am serious about this. Conservation is going to be a big part of the UN. We're going to do global conservation right off the bat. When he died, a lot of this energy of conservation died with the Truman administration. The Truman crowd had no interest. But in the end, our heritage in the United States of national parks like the Smokies, the Everglades, great roads like the Blue Ridge Parkway and Natchez Trace, and magical parks like Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, Isle Royal in Michigan. I can go on and on and on. We owe it to Franklin D. Roosevelt, for at our time of crisis in the Great Depression of World War I, reminded us that stewardship of our national resources was one of, if not the most important thing that we can do. Great countries take care of their landscapes. And Franklin Roosevelt, in my mind, along with TR, was one of the two great conservation presidents. Thank you. Thank you.
Doug, I have a comment before I ask my question. We just came back from Hyde Park, and you know that across the Hudson there is this walking bridge called the FDR Bridge, and I thought it was because he and Eleanor came from that area, but now you're saying maybe it was in tribute to the fact that this is the only bridge you can people can walk, no cars.
Yes, it is. That's part of why they've done that. But across the river from Hyde Park is home, John Burroughs. He's like John Muir, John Burroughs. If we're a book crowd here, look up and read about John Burroughs. He's very undersung. He lived directly across the street on the Hudson, and FDR would always have to go on the other side of the Hudson, and that bridge is a way to kind of connect that region.
Right, right. Now let me ask you a technical question. Going back to the relationship between Teddy and Franklin. Okay, you know when Teddy was police chief or whatever, he would walk in the streets with newspaper people, and he knew to use the newspapers as a vehicle to communicate. And you know, many years later, this guy, Franklin Roosevelt, just enhanced that to the radio. So that was a big, big change.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right. And TR was a genius at manipulating cartoonists. I mean, the teddy bear toy grew out of his going on a bear hunt, and he wouldn't shoot the bear in Mississippi, and it became a symbol for fair chase hunting and conservation of Theodore Roosevelt. FDR used radio so effectively to bring that voice because he was incapacitated, unable to walk. But what's not known about Franklin is he trained, his upper body was amazingly strong, and he would go fishing all over. He became a big buff on marine conservation, so he would pull in silver kings, giant tarpon, and go on these marine expeditions because that was a way for him to get outdoor recreation. And it was also a way not to have the press come with him because his health was deeply precarious at times. So if he could get out at sea and go to the dry Tortugas, which he saved in Florida, FDR, and spend time there, whenever he'd see a place that he liked, he'd sign in an executive order and save it. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah. Now let me get to the point. Today with the press, you see Trump, you see others saying, as president, I would do this, I would do this. A key point that when Franklin Roosevelt came into office, he used the term, let's try it, try it, try it. Did he inherit that from Teddy?
I'll tell you, I never quote Stalin in public, but I'm going to do it just for you guys. Stalin used to say after negotiating with Churchill and FDR, Churchill will work with you and then try to sneak his hand in your pocket to steal a coin. FDR smiles and greets you, jams both hands in, and pulls out everything all at once. It's very true. FDR loves, so all of these, people, when he tried to pack the Supreme Court, for example, people were all saying, oh, is he in 1937? People were turning in FDR. He was signing executive orders left and right, saving wild places because nobody knew what was going on. Then he got revenge on that by picking William O. Douglas, the most environmental, conservation-driven person of the 60s and 70s, who saved the C&O Canal, incidentally, here. And he put him to the Supreme Court. I also should tell you, the mall here that we're honoring at the National Book Festival, that's FDR. Months after he becomes president, he grabs all of the monuments, the mall, the White House, and puts it into Interior Department. They used to be run by other War Department, Agriculture. He made it. He built today's Interior Department, Franklin Roosevelt and Harold Ickes. And now our National Park Service keeps growing, and that's what FDR wanted, the history to be part of it, not just Yellowstones and Yosemites. So Barack Obama has just signed an executive order to do Stonewall for LGBT history. He just did, Obama did Cesar Chavez in California for Latino history. He just did Harriet Tubman in Maryland for Underground Railroad. He's opening up the narrative, as they're saying, of American history. Obama's been great at that. FDR is the one who started that ability to save labor strike places or something that wasn't, might be controversial, and save those as part of our national heritage. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I've had a chance to read both your books on Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. Thank you. They are absolutely magnificent. In reading them and in listening to you today, I observe that we've got one great Republican president and one great Democratic president. And for a long period of time, conservation and the environmental movement wasn't really a partisan issue. Now it's a very deeply partisan issue. What happened?
Amazing question. And it used to be Republican Party got into conservation all the time. Many of the heroes, including the Rockefeller family, who incidentally, who did Lawrence Rockefeller and John D. Jr. and the like, who did so much for it. Ronald Reagan created over 50 wilderness areas. That's roadless areas of pristine wilderness. Reagan did that. Today, you have a Republican Party that is running on oil, gas, drill, baby, drill, open, and there's a backlash against the federal government, particularly in the West and Alaska, so it puts things at loggerheads. So if you're a Republican in the Senate today, being a conservationist is very, very hard. The turning point in my mind was when the word conservation was replaced by environmental. George McGovern told me before he died, I wish we would have just kept the word conservation because it sounds like conservative. and I could push things through in the Senate. But once that word environment came, it was tied up to the 60s cultural wars of hippies and tree huggers and marijuana, and and it became seen as like a left issue out of the 60s, and we haven't fully recovered with that. However, there are Republican congressmen like Congressman Simpson from Idaho, who recently just saved Boulder White Clouds as a wilderness area. And there are a few Lamar Alexander of Tennessee has gotten into the conservation story quite a bit. But unfortunately, like so much in our culture, it's become partisan. And I'm hoping that eventually it'll come back, because if I go to a group of conservatives, Republicans somewhere, and talk about saving the local lake or river, they love me because I'm praising local sites and we want it clean. We want our kids to fish and hunt. But if I start dropping the E-bomb, environmental, you lose half your audience right now. So we've got to a lot of it might be the way we repackage how we speak about it but it's a frustration.
Thank you.
Barry Goldwater was a pretty good conservationist, actually.
Mr. Brinkley, I've read your book on Teddy Roosevelt. Looking forward to the book on FDR. Huge fan. Really appreciated your lecture today. I wanted to ask a question, or maybe get your thoughts on an issue that is related to the last question. In the course of your lecture and in your books, you describe the way the presidents use their authority to create and conserve these natural areas. But it seems that overwhelmingly, they relied upon the power of executive orders or unilateral executive branch authority, and particularly relying, I think it was on the Antiquities Act, which authorizes the president to apply that authority without consulting or getting the approval of Congress. And it's my amateur observation that over the decades, the fact that these conservation efforts took place through presidential authority, in many instances bypassing local congressional delegations without seeking the support of Congress, without needing the support of Congress, created a situation that has presented challenges in the modern era. And I recognize that the presidents needed to do what they needed to do. And I certainly approve of what they did. I love the result. But in your view, created something of a federalist problem in terms of this backlash of this assertion of federal authority?
Okay. I was to the national monuments, to keep it on FDR a little. FDR, for example, in the middle of World War II, was gifted Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And the Rockefellers bought all this land up. Now they're giving it to him. FDR signs an executive order saying we're going to create save the Grand Tetons, Jackson Hole. You should read what happened to FDR. You're Hitler, you're land grabbing, the federal government. There's nobody today that doesn't want Jackson Hole protected like FDR did. They were in California in Joshua Tree, that's FDR's. A woman named Ravana Hamilton Hoyt was trying to get it as a park through Congress said it's desert. Desert's a wasteland, nobody wants it. And she was a botanist and saying, no, these Joshua trees are amazing. Meanwhile, the kids that go out to Burning Man used to go out on the desert and pour gasoline and burn the Joshuas because they shoot up like a torch into the night. And they would look for the biggest and they burned them all. So she eventually gets to FDR and says, can you save it? And he looks at her plan and says, I'll save 1 million acres. And she said, well, the railroads have interest there and at local miners. He said, lawyers will figure it out later. We're going to do it. She was stunned she got what she wanted from him. In Kings Canyon, another national park of FDR's in California, it took the young unknown photographer named Ansel Adams, took these photos, and Eleanor Roosevelt said, if you want my husband to save something, bring the photos. He's a sucker for, Adams' photos. So he ended up seeing these and pushed to save Kings Canyon. But FDR didn't like that it was going to be roadless, no roads. And he said, I'm never going to be able to go see it, that area. Because if they're not roads and visitor lookouts, I won't be able to go because of my thing. But he did it at any rate. Because you just have to have a strong president do it, or else, I've been, for example, to Haiti. You want to fly over Hispaniola, look at Dominican Republic with forest, in Haiti deforested. I need you all to believe that in the 1930s and early 40s, our country was in genuinely awful shape. And swamps, Arctic tundra, deserts were not considered ecosystems worth saving. To now, these places are the big economic engines. Joshua Tree doesn't know what to do with visitors. It's so overcrowded. So the Antiquities Act gives presidents a mechanism. And George W. Bush signed a giant one out in the Hawaii for a marine area. Calvin Coolidge used to sign them all the time. I'm just suggesting that has become bipartisan. Monuments, presidents will do them. But Obama just did the Maine Woods, Kehatan, a couple weeks ago, and they're angry in Maine about it. Even though the land was gifted by Roxanne Quimby, who founded Burt's Bees, the women's product, she became the biggest landowner in Maine, said, I'll not only give you the land to the federal government as a park, but I'll also endow it with $20 million. And the conservatives in Maine don't want it. They see it as federal government intrusion into their lives. So the good news here, and I think I better end, the national parks on their centennial right now are spectacular. We need to love them more, visit them. They really are this great gift, and we owe both Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt a huge bit of credit for being visionaries of making our country something special. Without it, we would be strip malls and superhighways. But by saving all these wild places, it's kept the essential spirit of America, in my mind, alive. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.